Camie. I think what always is the first thing that stands out about her to me is all of her dark, thick hair that she had.
Welcome to Still a Part of Us, a place where moms and dads share the story of their child who was stillborn or who died in infancy. I'm Winter.
And I'm Lee. We are grateful you joined us today. Please note that this is a story of loss and has triggers.
Thanks to our lost parents who are willing to be vulnerable and share their children with us.
If you're listening to this podcast, just know that on our YouTube channel there are pictures and videos that are related to the stories that are being shared.
Subscribe and share it with a friend that might need it and tell them to subscribe. Why? Because people need to know that even though our babies are no longer with us, they're still a part of us. Welcome to Still a Part of Us. This is a really special episode that I'm looking forward to hearing about Camie's story. Kayla was so kind enough to reach out to tell a little bit about her, and I'm worried about it because I think I'm going to cry a lot. But thank you so much, Kayla, for coming and reaching out to us, coming and being on the podcast today.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. Okay, a couple of things before we get started. Can you tell us a little about you, where you guys are located, what your family looks like, and just so we can get to know you a little bit more.
Yep. So me and my husband and now two living kids, we live in Iowa in like the northeast corner.
Oh, okay.
Waterloo, Iowa. We live on an acreage outside of Waterloo. I work as a school psychologist. This is going into my 9th year of doing that.
Wow.
And my husband is a firefighter paramedic for the city of Waterloo and also runs his own construction business.
So you guys are busy.
Yeah, we stay busy, especially him. He stays really busy.
Yeah, I'm sure. And then two living kids right now.
Yep.
And how old are they?
Right now, our oldest daughter, Hallie, is about to turn 4 in just under a month. She'll be 4. And then our son, Daxon, is just turned 16 months.
Okay.
Goodness.
Okay. Yeah, you're like, oh, I gotta count. I know that's
right.
When you get into that little fun phase. Okay, so littles, they're pretty little then.
Mm-hmm. Yes, they keep, especially our son. I can't say I was prepared for like the toddler boy after having a girl first.
I know. It is surprising. You're like, what did I just do?
Yes, yeah. He keeps us on our toes.
Wonderful. And so you guys sound super busy, but are there any things that you guys like to do as a family and any hobbies that you guys like to do?
I can't say like collectively we have hobbies. We just like to get together with friends. We have a lot of friends in the area that it seems
Awesome.
like there's always something people are doing, whether it's low key, a bigger event. So we see a lot of friends pretty often. We go camping on some bigger camping trips with that group of friends a couple times a year. We like to be outside.
Yeah. Sounds great.
Yeah,
It sounds like you have a nice
yeah.
little group of people that you can support. They support each other. I think it's amazing.
Yeah.
Is your family, your husband and your families, are they from Iowa, that area, or are you guys is this a transplant type of a situation?
So both of us grew up in the area. I grew up in a town about an hour from here. My husband grew up 5 minutes from here.
Okay.
And so my husband's, a lot of his family is pretty close. His parents are still close. He's got a lot of cousins and extended family that are close. His siblings live a little further away. There's one a couple hours away, one in Chicago, and then one about an hour from us.
Yeah,
so they spread out a little bit.
But generally in that still kind of close.
Yeah, yep. And then my family, after me and I have one sister, after we were out of the house, my parents moved to Minnesota to follow a job. And then my sister went to college in Minnesota and stayed there. So my family left me.
You're like, rude.
Yeah.
You abandoned me. It happens.
Right.
Okay, that sounds great. And then, so your husband so you and your husband, have you guys known each other? Like, how long ago did you guys get married? And
we have been married. It will be 5 years in
Okay.
October.
Okay.
We were together 6 years before we got married.
Mm.
5 or 6 years. No, 5. But we met when my husband moved back he was in the Navy for 6
Okay.
years before we met. When he moved back to Iowa, we both ended up he ended up at Wartburg College, where I went to school too. And we ended up doing respite care for the same
Oh.
family. And so we kind of met through that, but then had
Huh.
mutual friends. And I had a friend whose boyfriend at the time was living with him. So just ended up spending more time with him eventually.
Yeah, and that's the way it goes. That's great.
Yeah.
How that we always appreciate those kind of connections that
Right.
bring us together. Okay, and then can you give us a little bit of context? How long ago was Camie born at the time of this recording?
Yep. She almost 2.5 years ago. So she was born in March of 2022.
Okay. So just want to point that out that this is kind of sort of there's still COVID precautions maybe.
Right.
And
It
so
was still a little restricted, but
yeah.
not like when we had our oldest daughter in 2020.
Right, which probably was total lockdown. Yeah,
Yeah.
pretty strict. Okay. So
Mhm.
just I like to give people context so that they understand that some of the things that happen, that can play into
Right.
some of the things that occurred. So so you had your oldest daughter
Yes.
and were you guys planning on getting pregnant with Camie then?
Um, yeah, we've been fortunate that we're the type of people that it's like we talk about getting pregnant and we get pregnant.
Okay.
And it actually, when our oldest daughter started sleeping through the night, I was finally like, okay, maybe now
Yeah.
we can have more kids now. This is
Yeah.
doable. Where
Okay.
before I was
Okay.
like, no, we're gonna have one because we cannot handle
I
this.
know. Sleep
But so
deprivation
I
is
think
real.
Hallie was maybe 10 months old when we
Okay.
got pregnant with Camie. Because when she was born, they were 18 months apart. So they were
Yeah.
close.
Yeah. Okay. So you guys had just mentioned it, and then it just so happened that you got pregnant
Yeah,
pretty quickly.
we're very lucky in
Okay.
that sense. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So then, and were you surprised a little bit about that?
Um, yeah, a little bit. It didn't take us long to get pregnant with Hallie either, but that's always like a fear in the back of
Yeah.
your mind that maybe this time, because every time is different.
Mm-hmm.
So a little bit surprised. I was also still like breastfeeding Hallie at the time, and I know
Yeah.
that like that can impact things. So, yeah, we were a little bit surprised, but mostly like, wow, this did happen right away.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah. Okay. And it sounds like you weren't necessarily preventing, like you weren't taking any contraception or anything.
No.
You guys were just like breastfeeding. I mean, all of things. Okay.
Yep.
That sounds good. Okay, so then that's exciting. Did you guys tell your families? Like, did you how did that
We
look?
we waited a little bit, and not we told our families right away with our first,
Mm-hmm.
and we didn't wait necessarily out of fear, but we didn't want to. Our oldest was about to turn 1, and we didn't want to like take away from that
Oh,
really.
yeah, totally.
So we were back and forth on when to tell people, how to tell people, and we actually ended up at our oldest daughter's first birthday party. After we'd kind of done the birthday party, I changed her into like a promoted to big sister shirt. And then when we
Oh,
brought her out from that, that's kind of how we told, because we're like, well, all our family's here, all of our friends, our close friends are here. So I think it was my husband who was finally like, that's like the perfect time to tell everyone. I was like, yeah, okay.
okay.
So it was
That's
after
really
the
cute.
first trimester, but I have somewhere.
Yeah, okay. That's really cute though. Let her have her spotlight and then
Yeah.
that is super fun. So when you first found out that you're pregnant, what kind of maternal care did you end up going into your doctor's office? I don't know. Some people go in pretty
Right.
quickly and then others wait a minute just because that's the way their doctors roll.
Right.
And so
I had called them right away just to get like appointments,
yeah.
and the first intake appointment that they do, unless you have a reason for concern, is just like over the phone history questions. And that was around 8 weeks. So we did that. And then my first real appointment was at 12 weeks, where they
Okay.
do the first ultrasound, double check dating. So yeah, otherwise it was pretty standard. I did end up having COVID somewhere around like 9 weeks.
Okay.
And the only thing that impacted was like the practice of care. So I had 2 more scheduled ultrasounds in the 3rd trimester that aren't typically done at
Gotcha.
in most practices around here. But
Yeah. Okay.
otherwise, it didn't bring up any concerns.
Gotcha. I think that's great that they were trying to monitor the
Hmm.
effects that could have impacted the pregnancy.
Yeah. And from what I've learned, because I know everything is still learning about the
Uh-huh.
impacts of COVID even now.
Yep.
At that point, it seemed like there was maybe potential for like impact on the placenta. So I
Yeah.
also was taking baby aspirin.
Okay.
But other than that, there was no concerns
Gotcha.
ever
Were
from
you
it.
pretty sick with COVID when you got it?
Not really. I had a pretty bad cough, but that
Okay.
was really it. I was never like fever, body aches,
Okay.
just a bad cough that you can't take anything for because you're
Right.
pregnant.
Yeah.
So
So great, isn't it?
right.
Okay, so that is good to know. And then how are you feeling in that first trimester even before you went in for that appointment?
Yeah, I felt really good. I mean, tired like you
Mm.
do,
Yep.
but didn't have any like nausea, sickness. And so I was convinced she was a boy because I had some of that with our first and
Mhm.
then didn't with Camie. And so I was sure that she was going to be a boy.
Okay. And then you went in for that 12-week appointment, that
Yep.
first appointment. How did everything look?
Good. There was nothing that stood out. It was just routine. Did the
Okay.
blood work that they do.
Yeah.
Ultrasound looked good. Yeah,
Okay.
there were no concerns.
Awesome. And were you guys planning on finding out
Hmm.
the gender like at the 20-week appointment, or did you do
Yeah.
genetic testing or anything like
So
that?
we decided to wait till our 20-week appointment.
Okay.
With our oldest, we did the genetic testing, but more not so we didn't even know you could find out the gender when we first
Oh,
decided we
okay.
were going to do the genetic testing. It
Uh-huh.
was just like first time parents, nervous about all the things. So
Yeah.
we're like, we're
Yeah.
just going to do it so we don't have to worry about it.
Mhm.
And then they're like, are you going to find out the gender? We're like, oh yeah, we
Mhm.
really are. That's great. We can find out already. But then with Camie being our second, not being like high risk for any genetic things, we
Yeah.
decided that we could wait until the 20-week ultrasound
Okay.
to find out what we were having.
Awesome. Okay. And then how are things progressing throughout kind of the second trimester? Are you feeling okay?
Yeah.
Everything okay? Nothing of note?
No, I like nothing is standing out in my head about
Okay.
that time.
Okay.
Hallie was still, I mean, a baby,
Yeah.
barely a toddler. So we were
Yeah.
just busy
Yeah.
doing all the things. But
Always.
yeah,
Always.
nope, it was smooth and good.
Okay. And when you went in for your 20-week ultrasound, did you do it around 20 weeks or was it a little
Yeah.
earlier,
Nope,
later?
it was right somewhere in that 20th week.
Okay.
It fell.
And how about your husband? Was he able to come to?
Yeah. Yep.
Awesome.
And
Okay.
so even with our oldest during like height and cova, he could come to the big appointments. So the
Oh, good.
ultrasound appointments. I think by the time we were pregnant with Camie, he could have come to every
Mm-hmm.
appointment if he wanted to, but it's too difficult to schedule around his schedule and my schedule. And
Right.
so he
Right.
did come to the big ultrasound ones though,
Okay.
for Camie as well.
Great.
And because we were finding out the gender at the
Yes.
20-week, he came
It's
to that
always
one.
yeah. It's always nice to do that. So yeah, tell me about that appointment. How did things look on that one?
If everything was good, and it's always like during the ultrasound, the ultrasound techs do it at like the hospital we go to.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then if there's anything that's noted, the doctor and you're like meeting with them afterwards is
Correct.
who like talks about that with
Okay.
you.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, during the ultrasound, nothing of note stood out. Everything was looking good. We found out she was a girl. I think we were both kind of surprised,
Mm-hmm.
but excited. I think my husband really, even though I at the time was nervous about 2 girls, like having that girl dad title, I think he was kind of excited about it.
Yeah. That's so cute.
But yeah, so the ultrasound was good. And then we met with the doctor after, and she had mentioned that there was a choroid plexus cyst on her brain, however, which can be an indicator of like a genetic abnormality.
Okay.
However, when it's not present with other indicators, and I don't remember what those are at this time, the likelihood of it being anything is pretty low. And so they said we could either wait till our 28 week and see if it went away. And basically, from what I remember them telling me, and they said, don't Google it, but I'm someone that has to have like all of the information. And so I Googled it.
Yeah, totally.
And just as the brain's developing, part of it can get kind of like pinched off and make this cyst that eventually just gets absorbed and isn't a problem in most
Yeah.
cases. And so we could either do the genetic testing then that we didn't do it at 12 weeks, or we could wait till our 20-week ultrasound and just see if it had resolved.
Yeah.
But we, mostly me, decided that I couldn't wait another 8 weeks to know the answer. And so then we did the genetic testing and everything came back low risk.
Okay.
So it was a like non-consequential piece. It was just how she was developing.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That it's always funny. Like they always say, don't Google it. And you're like,
Right.
I'm going to. And it's the worst possible things that could
Right. Oh
possibly
yeah.
be
It
there.
was like trisomy 13, like all
Yeah.
of the non-compatible with life things. And I was like, okay, well, if this is just now I'm prepared, I guess. But everything was like, usually it's present with this and present with this.
Right.
And none of that was there. So the midwife that we saw for that appointment was very much like, I really don't think this is going to be anything because of these reasons, but we do just need to double check at some point to make sure.
Right. Okay. So, you guys found out you were also having a girl, which is super fun. Did you have any names kind of chosen out to?
No, with our first, I was like reading the like 50,000 name like baby book to like come up with all the
Totally.
possibilities.
Yeah.
And as soon as I read Hallie in the book, even though I kept like considering other names, I just knew that that was her name. And then we just lived in fear for like 4 more months that someone would pick that name because of that like family friend group that we have.
Yeah. Were they
5
having
or 6
kids?
people had kids like within the month or 2 before us.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
And so we were like,
Please.
please don't pick that name.
It's a real fear.
Yeah.
Because if you're like, I hang out so much with you people.
Right. But with Camie, we had a hard time. Maybe I had a hard time more than my husband, but every name felt like a second choice name to me because Hallie was like our most favorite name.
Yeah.
And so then to come up with another girl name, they all just felt like the second best name.
Oh, the runner-up
And
name.
so we had a really hard time. And one of them that was our favorite was Lexi. And I'm big on like thinking about nicknames and how are the like letters going to sound. And one day it just like popped into my head that someday someone is going to call her Sexy Lexi. And I couldn't forget that. And ever since I said that, we were like, we can't name our poor child that because she'll come home one day and crying because somebody said this to her and we'll be like, sorry, we knew it was going to happen anyway.
And we did it anyway. Yes. Yeah. I'm glad I'm not the only person that does that, to like think of all the possible things that your kid could be made fun of because of their name.
Right. But actually, I was watching the show on Netflix, Emily in Paris at the time. And Camille, who they call Camie, but with the French accent that I'm not going to try and replicate, that like stood out to me. So we actually got her name from the character in Emily in Paris.
Fun.
And went with Camie.
That's awesome. And then I guess we can talk about this a little bit later if this makes more sense. But Rose, you is the middle name, right?
Yep, and that's my mother-in-law's name. So my husband's mom's name.
Yeah, that's a really. I mean, and it's just really pretty. I was like,
yeah, it is pretty combination.
Okay, and then so you guys are going along. This is your second girl. Did you guys end up having another like baby shower or anything like that? A little sprinkle?
No, we didn't.
Okay. I know lots of times it's like, oh, we're just going to pass on the clothes from the first one. And so.
And I have, well, my husband would probably agree, a shopping problem when it comes to like kids things. And it was hard because our girls were going to be opposite seasons. Yeah. And so we still, because Hallie was September and Camie was March. And so like all of Hallie's 3-month clothes were Christmas. And Camie would have been 3 months in like June. And so I did end up buying more clothes than you would expect for another girl, probably.
Gotcha. Okay. That makes sense, man. Yeah.
Right.
To be opposite on the seasons. Yeah. You need to make sure that they're cozy or not too hot. Yeah. Okay. So then you're going along as we go along there, other things are starting to like, you guys are starting to have a few more appointments. How are those looking? Because you said you were going to have an ultrasound did you end up having an ultrasound on the week 28?
Yeah. So because of having COVID, I still had a 28-week growth check.
Oh, great.
Ultrasound. And everything looked good there. The cyst was resolved.
Oh, good.
And nothing else came up. She was measuring smaller than Hallie, but not like concerning small, just smaller.
Okay.
And then we had appointments kept going well and had another ultrasound at 36 weeks. Again, just to check growth right towards the end, and everything looked good there as well.
Okay, awesome. And did you guys what were your kind of birth preferences as you were starting? Because obviously you had one at 36 weeks and they really start like, okay, how are we doing this?
Yeah.
What are you planning on doing?
Um, so our first was actually a scheduled C-section. Hallie was footling breech. And so
Oh,
she was delivered by C-section.
okay.
And knowing, we always thought that we wanted a bigger family, and knowing that sometimes C-sections can limit that,
Mm-hmm.
we had agreed that if our team thought I was a good candidate for a VBAC, that's what we wanted to do, just
Okay.
to avoid having the multiple surgeries.
Right.
And having a little toddler at home, not being able to lift things and
Mm-hmm.
do things with her, with my
Mm-hmm.
husband being gone for 24 hours at a time for his
Yeah.
shifts, wasn't going to be ideal either. And so we had been talking about that all through the pregnancy,
Okay.
on that being kind of the plan unless things came up. And I'm a very like research person, and I had
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
felt like I really looked into like the risks and the benefits and like what to look out for, what to talk with your team about in terms of like making sure you stay safe during a
Yeah.
VBAC and all of those things. And all the doctors we saw and like agreed that we would be a good candidate because Hallie wasn't a C-section because of like failure to progress or complications during delivery or anything like that. It was because of her position. And
Yeah.
Camie was in good position.
Good.
So they thought I would be a good candidate. So that was our plan for her
Okay.
delivery,
Okay.
and stayed the plan.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah. Cause I know that with the VBAC, there's usually, so vaginal birth after a cesarean, there's usually like possibility of rupturing a uterus
Mhm.
or something like that. And
Right.
so they felt like you guys were safe enough and,
Yep.
you looked healthy enough to do that essentially.
Mhm. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Awesome. Okay. So then, as you are progressing along, did you guys have any, so you had the 2 extra ultrasound. Were there any other like non-stress tests that you did or
No.
any other sort of extras that you did as you kind of got along the line?
Nope, just our routine, like every 2 weeks and then every week appointments as you get in that last month.
Yeah.
And everything was looking good.
Everything was good.
Hmm.
Like no high blood pressure, that type of
Nope.
thing. No, weird protein in your urine. I mean, those are all these things that people
Right.
look out for. And that
Nope.
actually
No,
was
there was nothing abnormal that came up or stood out.
okay. And so then let's get into like figuring out what happened as we get a little bit
Hmm.
closer to what happened. So can you tell us that appointment that you went to?
So I had my 39-week appointment. Well, so somewhere, Cammy was born at the end of March, and I work in the school, so I have a school year schedule. And
Mm.
I had decided that I was going to be done working at spring break. Just it was
Oh,
giving me a
right.
lot of anxiety
Totally.
after Hallie's birth was scheduled, knowing when I was going to be done working, when all of these things. I was
Yeah.
having a lot of anxiety about not knowing when
Right.
Cammy was coming.
Yeah.
And so I decided I was going to be done working at spring break. So I had about a week and a half at home just to like do the things, spend time with Hallie, get ready for everything at
Mm-hmm.
home. And at my 39-week appointment, everything was still looking good. I was like dilated to a 1, and I was like, well, this is a bummer. But she did a membrane sweep to try and like kickstart things. And then it was Wednesday, March 30th. Me and my daughter Hallie, we like went and ran to the grocery store that morning.
Mm-hmm.
My appointment had been the day or two before.
Okay.
We went to the grocery store. They're all kind of in like a strip mall line of each
Yeah.
other.
Yeah.
We went to like the pet store to look around at the
Yeah.
pets because she
Yeah.
loves animals.
Right.
And then we went to the bookstore and just spent time in there playing with the things, looking at the books. And then we got home, and my husband was on shift that day. And so his schedule, he works 24 hours on
Mm-hmm.
shift and then he's off for 48 hours. But he was on shift, and I got home and I texted him. I'm like, don't change anything yet. Don't freak out. But I think my water might have just broken. But it was, so with Hallie, my water actually broke the day before
Oh,
our
okay.
scheduled C-section. But that was like the movie water broke, like gush of water. Like
Okay.
you have no question that that's what happened.
Mm-hmm.
This time it was like slow leak. And I was like, it might have happened, but I'm actually not quite sure. So just get plans maybe ready, but don't like freak out yet.
Okay. Okay.
And so then I was getting Hallie lunch and just like kept like leaking. And so I called him and I'm like, yeah, we probably need to go in. And being a VBAC, I didn't want to really labor at home because a big like
Y-
monitoring thing is just monitoring throughout because
Right.
ruptures happen actually in like the 4 to 6 centimeter dilation range.
Oh,
And
okay.
and monitoring fetal heart rate is one of like the first signs of like problem, really. So I didn't want to like take a lot of time trying to wait for things to start or happen. So he got things ready at work. I mean, the guys they figured it all out. They were fine. And he came home. I called our daycare and asked if we could drop Hallie off. And they were great. They've been great since we've been with them. And so we dropped her off. And then I remember dropping her off and just being like so emotional about like her not being our only baby anymore and her world
Oh,
going to be turned upside down.
yeah.
While also like so excited, but so sad about that for
Yes.
her.
Yes.
But yeah, and then we headed to the hospital, set things up. I'm trying to remember I think my in-laws were set to pick her up and be with Hallie while we were at the hospital.
Yeah.
But we got to the hospital and we go to the triage where they just make sure you're actually in labor, decide what's going to happen, make sure that your water actually broke, which they confirmed that mine did. And after my water broke, I did start having contractions
Okay.
pretty regularly. And it was very comparable to Hallie's. Once they started, they weren't bad, but they were like every 2 to 3 minutes. Like they weren't far apart ever.
Okay.
And they pretty quickly like got uncomfortable, but not like unbearable.
Okay.
So once they confirmed that, yes, I was in labor, they came in to talk to us about options because I had what's called premature rupture of membranes where my water broke so early, but I was only like 2 centimeters dilated. They started talking about induction measures, essentially knowing we wanted a VBAC, but you also have to be careful because you can't do like super intense things.
Right.
And make it more risky. So the plan was to start with the bulb catheter. I don't know the full actual name of it. I feel like people refer to it as different things, but basically it just puts pressure on the cervix to try and encourage it to dilate. And then we're going to start with low doses of Pitocin to get things like moving along. So we got settled in our room and everyone was kind of like, okay, that was probably like early afternoon, between 1 and 2 o'clock by the time we got into our room. And everyone's like, well, it's going to probably be a long night, but just get comfortable. It'll be fine. Like we're here. It's good. And so we were, just hanging out. And it was some of my husband's cousins had actually delivered their daughter 9 or 10 days before Camie was born. And she was just having some oxygen difficulty. So she was still at the hospital.
There.
So they stopped in and they're like, yeah, you're having a baby today.
Yeah.
And so everyone was just like, excited and relaxed. I was a little like I was nervous just because of the VBAC and just like had those worries in the back of my mind, but really trusted our team. And I was very much like, whatever you think needs to happen, I'm good with. Like, I'm not going to fight you on anything. Whatever's best, you just tell me and that's good.
Great. Okay.
And so pretty quickly contractions got pretty I was like, I don't know why I was trying to be brave through them because I knew I was going to get an epidural.
Oh, okay.
And really my biggest reason for that was in case we had to go to an emergency C-section, I didn't want to be put under general anesthesia.
Gotcha.
And so I wanted to have that already in place.
Yeah.
But then contractions started getting pretty painful. And so I was like, eventually it was probably like 2 or 3 hours. And I was like, yes, please bring this epidural to me now.
Yeah. Okay.
And somewhere I don't even remember what time I got the epidural, probably like, I want to say it was around 5, maybe. And I just remember while they were putting in it, and I wasn't worried about it because I had to get the spinal for the C-section. And so I was kind of used to people poking around in your back and the hunched over. But I just remember like trembling while they were doing it. And they're like, are you cold? I'm like, I don't think so, but I must be. I'm like shaking and I can't stop.
Oh.
And so they got the epidural in and it worked great. They give you the button. So if you start to feel things, you can give it an extra boost. And I never needed it. Worked like I couldn't feel a single thing.
Yeah.
So it was working great. Shortly after they placed it, I remember they gave me some blood pressure medication because my blood pressure was kind of low, but my blood pressure sits kind of low anyway. Like usually it's like 100/60 instead of like the
Okay.
one. And so, but they gave me some just in case. And I was like,
Okay.
yeah, whatever you think. And I don't remember if it was right away or just sometime after I got the epidural. Camie started to only be happy if I was on my left side. Like her heart rate would decel a little bit if I was anywhere but my left side.
Okay.
And that's like the one time through everything where I go back and wish that I would have just like called it at that point. Like in my head, I just like leading up to this, I remember telling myself if there's ever like any red flag, even if it's like a little tiny yellow flag, just do the C-section. Like don't try and
Yeah.
like don't do any, but everyone was so, and like one of my friends had their baby, I don't know, maybe a few months before that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in the September before Camie was born. In her birth story, she talked about how she was like, they had her on this side and on this side and on like moving all over because his heart rate was kind of all over the place and
Yeah.
everything was fine. And so I just remember thinking about that and being like, this happens. Like, it's okay. I know people who have had this happen. So I didn't like do intervene or ask about anything. And of all the things that all the decisions we had to make, all the like chaos that ensued after, like that's the one piece I go back to and wish
Ugh.
I would have done something differently,
Yeah.
which is crazy because of all the things that follow. But it's like that one moment in time where I feel like we could have made a difference.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, pretty quickly after that, I think it was about 8 o'clock. The midwife came in to check and see like how I was dilated with the catheter. Cause I think the plan was to have it in for like 6 hours. I don't even, a certain amount of time, hoping to get me to like a 5 or a 6. And then it would fall out and then start the Pitocin. When she came to check, it had fallen out. I was at like an 8. I didn't even
Oh,
know. And so
okay.
she was like, oh, wow, like this is your body figured it out. Like we never had to start the Pitocin. Things progressed like very quickly.
Okay.
And so she went then to check on a couple more people and came back around, I don't know, 8:45, 9 o'clock, somewhere in there, to check me again. And when the nurse who was like taking notes asked, she was like, what do you want me to put? And she's like, right there. Like, it's time to have this baby. And so then everyone was like, okay, and me and my husband were like, okay, I guess we're
Okay.
having a baby.
Yeah,
Like, here
yeah.
we go. And then still like, there wasn't any like worry or like chaos or like nothing still that anything was really wrong. Then the next like half hour, 45 minutes, I like generally know what happened, but I kind of is a blur because it really escalated very quickly.
Right, right.
After a few pushes, and I was getting frustrated because I couldn't feel, they were like, can you feel it all when you're having a contraction? Like, I can't tell at all. I have no, like,
Okay.
I was maybe too numb from the epidural. I don't know. And so they were trying to gauge, but right away they were, because I'd never delivered a baby
Right.
vaginally before.
Right.
Right away they were like, no, your pushes, they're great. Like, that's good. Keep doing that. And pretty quickly, I remember we switched to pushing every other contraction because Camie's heart rate started to dip and they wanted to give her more time to recover in between
Okay.
them. And I have no idea how long that waited until they called. So the midwives generally handle all like routine deliveries to leave the OBs available for C-sections, emergencies, those types of things.
Mm-hmm.
So up till this point, I had just been dealing with a midwife who was one of my like favorite ones. And because when you go into, unless it's something scheduled, you just have whoever's on call.
Yeah.
In the team, which
Right.
is very routine around here. And it was one of my favorite midwives, so I was very happy about that. And I have no idea how much time passed before she first consulted with the OB that was on call. And at some point in there, they had me have oxygen to help like get oxygen to Camie.
Okay.
And then again, I have no idea how long I continued to push until the OB kind of came in and took over. And in the next chunk of time, I can't tell you what happened first, next in the order, because there was a point where I like dissociated. Like I was not there. I was doing what they told me, but was not like present. They put one of the like head monitors on her head to try and pick up her heartbeat because they kept losing it. They couldn't get it on like the fetal monitor. And so they put that on to try and like help gauge how she was doing. They attempted to do a vacuum assist just to get her out faster, but ended up not using it because again, they kept saying that I was pushing really well. And so they used it once, but then stopped using it because they're like, it's not the benefit of it isn't worth, or the risk of it, I guess,
Yeah.
isn't worth, it's not
Yeah.
doing much for you. At some point in there, the OB asked if we wanted to do an emergency C-section. And I feel bad because in all the decisions that were made, I never consulted with my husband. I just like made them on my own in like the heat of the moment. And I remember as soon as she asked that, I was just so worried about her being so far in the birth canal already to then pull her back out because I'd heard of like the trauma that can cause. And so decided not to go forward with the emergency C-section. And I was also worried about the other trauma it might cause. I was holding on to how they had been telling me I was pushing so well anyway that I could like get it done fast. I was worried about the time, even though I know like they can get you to that situation so quickly. I was worried about what time we might lose in that transition. And then I told myself, if this was our only option, like if they thought this was the thing we had to do, that's what they would have said. They would have said, we need to take you back for a C-section. They wouldn't have given us the option. And so we didn't. And then she was born at 9:30. So this whole like pushing phase wasn't very long.
No.
And I think that sometimes when people who don't know the details of our story, and not that we kept it a secret, it's just we didn't post all of these details on Facebook or to let everybody know. I think that's the thing that catches people off guard is because sometimes you assume that things like this happen because someone was pushing for 3 or more hours or had an extended like labor. And it was very like from when my water broke to when she was born was like 9 hours. So it wasn't crazy long. The whole like time was very fast and chaotic. And I just remember at one point after I like left my body and then like when I came back to reality, as I say, I like looked around our room and we were like that room, as I like to say, where there's like 15 people in there. And I recognized one of them was the anesthesiologist who had done my epidural. So I knew why he was there. But all the other ones I'm like, I didn't know. And then I knew they were for Camie. And at the hospital we deliver at, they have what's called an NICU. And so instead of taking the baby to the NICU team comes to your room and the baby, they do everything in your room. The baby stays in your room, which is one of the reasons why we chose the hospital. Even when Hallie was born, we just liked that concept. So after Camie was born, I didn't even realize that she had been delivered. Again, I couldn't feel anything. I was just like, mission, go, get her out. And they're like, she's here. Like she had at some point in the delivery, they're like, she has so much hair. And I was like, really? And they're like, yeah, like a ton. And they laid her on me. And I just remember like pushing her away because I knew I knew that it wasn't good. And just given how everything had gone. The next chunk of time, which again, it wasn't super long. It just felt like forever. Because I'm laying there in the bed getting stitched up and cleaned up and delivering the placenta and all those things. And we can't see anything, but there's like 7 people around Camie just trying to keep her with us, basically. It was hard in that moment having the NICU in there because we heard them like counting compressions and yelling for all the things that they needed. They got her stabilized pretty quickly. It didn't feel like it in the time and it still felt like very chaotic. But after, I don't know, maybe 20 minutes, the neonatologist came over. Well, and in the like chaos, I don't even know the title of this lady, but was in there with us, asked if we wanted her baptized. And again, a decision I did not consult my husband on. We're religious people, but haven't our views on faith have changed just with events through our lives, and don't have a church that we're actively like practicing with. So our oldest daughter is not baptized. And but I just was like in that panic mode, and I was like, yes, please baptize her. So she baptized her like while they're doing all the crazy things. And after everything settled down, and again, I have no idea. I don't know what time, I don't know how long it was. I don't know what time it is. The neonatologist, my team of doctors had kind of left. The neonatologist and just 2 or 3 nurses were who was left in the room. He came over to talk to us and kind of explain like what happened, what was going on. And he had said that she never like fully lost her heartbeat, but for babies, they start like compressions and like life-saving measures if their heart rate's, I think my husband said below 60. Being a paramedic, he has some of this knowledge, and was probably more aware of what they were doing in the room than I was, just because he has experience with some of that stuff. So she never like had no heartbeat, but they took, because of everything that happened, they took a blood gas sample from her umbilical cord, and the levels of it indicated that she had suffered a lack of blood flow and then oxygen to her brain at some point during delivery, leading up to delivery. There wasn't, sometimes like the obvious causes of that are like uterine rupture, placental abruption, knots in the cord, and there was nothing obvious to what would have caused that for Camie. And so everyone was really, I don't want to say confused, but confused about like why this happened. He then let us know that they had called the University of Iowa's NICU team to come and get Camie because of the lack of blood flow and oxygen, which is categorized as a hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, like injury. She qualified for a therapeutic treatment or a therapeutic cooling treatment, which is basically they cool the body temperature down to like 92 or 93 degrees to prevent further brain damage. And I didn't, it was probably months later before I actually looked into like, why does cooling do this? And when brain cells die, they release a toxin that can then damage other brain cells. And so the cooling prevents that from happening. And so it's an effort to try and prevent further brain damage.
Right.
When she was born that night, it was a weird, like early spring winter storm. It was like sleeting and snowy. And so the air care or like the life flight team couldn't fly. So they took the ambulance to come, which it made like, originally they said they were going to be there at midnight. And I don't think they got there until 1:30 maybe. And finally at one point, because the plan was for my husband then to drive down to Iowa City, like after they left, which is about, I say a long hour, like an hour and 10 minutes, hour and 15 minutes from the hospital we were at. But he would have had no sleep. And so I told him to like lay down on the couch and try and like get some sleep, and I'll like wake you up if they get here, when they get here, if anything happens. So they got here, that team got to the hospital, I think around 1:30, and they start the cooling right there. So they put her on like a cooling mat and like cooling blankets to start cooling her down, because there's like a 6-hour window of time to start this treatment. For it to be most effective, I guess. I guess backing up just a couple hours after they had Camie stabilized and I was like just laying there, they did help me get out of bed to like go over and see her. And she was laying there pretty lifeless, like not moving like a newborn baby would, but her eyes were open. And it was just really hard, like not being able to hold her. All the things you like think about as a newborn.
Was she hooked up to a lot of
so she was on the vent. They did intubate her. She was on a vent. She had umbilical lines. So it just helps so that they don't have to like continuously like try and get IVs, or she didn't have an IV at that point, but it helps for like blood draws and medication and all the tests. I don't really know, but they insert them right into the umbilical cord. And I think that was it. I mean, I think she had like a blood pressure monitor on and
Right.
like heart rate, like general just monitoring things. But those were the big things at that time, I think. And so then once the Iowa City team left, my husband, I think he just left right from the hospital. I don't think he stopped home
Okay.
and got down to Iowa City around 4:30 or 5, I think. And then was able, he went right up to the NICU, but had to wait in like a waiting room
Right.
place
Oh,
until
okay.
they had her settled in
Okay.
her room. My father-in-law, because we called after everything had kind of settled down, we called our parents
Okay.
to let them know as much as we knew of what
Right.
was going on.
Right.
Um, and then I had text I have a really close group of four of us, but three of my friends from college. And I had text them and let them know. And they all, I don't know why they were awake at midnight, but they all like responded to me.
Yeah.
And it was like my mom, of course, and my friends, they asked like if anybody do I want somebody at the hospital with me? And I'm a very like private person. I like to process on my own, be on my own with my
Yeah.
feelings.
Mhm.
And so I didn't want somebody there in my space at the time,
Mhm.
which I think was hard, maybe especially for my mom, because she's a nurturer and like that's how
Yeah.
she loves. So they got down to Iowa City. My father-in-law actually drove down to Iowa City to be with my husband, which I was thankful for, just so that Ben didn't have to be alone.
Yeah.
And then the next morning, um, my team just they talked about once we get like your blood work to make sure that you're okay, we'll try and discharge you early. If not, if something like comes up, we'll try and get you transferred down there. So through the morning, I was kind of just sitting there
Yeah.
alone, like just waiting.
Yeah.
I don't know what happened, but they never came to like take my blood to
Oh,
see, like mostly I think it's the biggest thing to check like iron levels to make sure
right.
that you're not anemic or like hemorrhaging that they don't know about
Yeah.
or whatever.
Yeah. Mhm.
But it was about noon, maybe late morning or noon. The midwife came in and she's like, "You aren't showing any signs of anything concerning. We're just going to discharge you, so you can get down there," which I was thankful for. So my mother-in-law came and picked me up. We stopped by our house, and then she drove me down to Iowa City. Um, and
Were you feeling okay? Like
I
physically?
mean, I was physically uncomfortable, but
Oh,
not like I walked out of the hospital. I walked into Iowa City slowly, and maybe it would have been smarter to use a wheelchair, but I didn't.
yeah.
I also didn't know how far I was going to have to walk when we got to Iowa City, so I'm retrospectively probably would have like grabbed a chair.
Fitting, yeah.
Um, Part of that, so at the time, Iowa City, they weren't under like their full like COVID shutdown like it used to be, but there
Yeah.
can only be 2 people per day, like in each room. And so at that time, they were bending the rules a little bit because of the situation, but
Yeah.
knowing that like, and they weren't trying to overstay either. Like they
Yeah.
made sure I got up there and then pretty quickly they both left.
Okay.
Um, so when I walked in, they had Camille situated. She was still on the vent. She still had like her umbilical lines, the monitoring things, and they had hooked her up to a 24-hour video EKG. So they were monitoring for seizure activity.
Yeah.
Um, and it was like the video part of it was so like, because at times if you're like interacting with her, there might be like activity on the
Yeah.
EKG, and then they can look and see, oh, mom was just over there talking to her. That's why this isn't like a seizure type of thing. Um, and I mean, besides seeing your baby hooked up to all of the things, I mean, we could like touch her hand, but we really
Mhm.
couldn't we couldn't hold her
Hold her.
because
Yeah.
they want her to stay cool.
Yeah.
Um, and so that was hard,
Yeah.
but otherwise I just not really knowing what and not even know what this meant. We have our 18-month-old daughter at home who we were planning on being away from for like 2 nights. We never left her overnight before.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
just like feeling all of the things.
Yeah. That's so much. Before we get too far, I want to ask a couple of questions just so that I can make sure that we capture this.
Yeah.
How big was Camie when she was born? Because I don't know, like in the rush to take care of her and get her revived? Were they able to weigh her and get all her stats and everything? Like how big was she? And
At some point they did.
okay.
And I don't know if it was in Waterloo or if it was in Iowa City.
Okay.
But she was 7 pounds, 10 ounces.
Okay. So she was pretty good
And
size.
yeah. And our oldest daughter was 8 pounds, 4 ounces. So she was,
Okay.
I mean, smaller, but
Yeah.
not like a tiny baby.
Yeah.
And like 20.25 inches long, I
Okay.
think.
Yeah. So pretty long as well. I mean, like
Yeah.
good length.
Yeah.
And when you guys were in Waterloo at your the hospital there, when you did talk to the neonatologists, because I know that you said that when they put Camie on you, and you kind of just knew something was not quite right, and you wanted to basically get her to the people that can help her. When they came back and talked to you about that, what did they explain anything about what their thoughts were on how she would do, or any sort of prognosis at that time?
I think at that point, I mean, he maybe had an idea of like what the outcome, but and it's hard because it's hard to remember like what they told us versus like the doctors once we got to Iowa City.
Right.
But her her blood oxygen levels were pretty low. And he did point out that they were like very low on like the scale of low. And then just explained what this hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy injury means, that she suffered. But otherwise, that was kind of it. And we as we went through, we came to learn that that's probably really all the information he really had, because so much of like the clearer picture happened like days later once we were in Iowa City and she could undergo some more testing.
Gotcha.
So he just like knew in that moment, this is what we're dealing with. And maybe like because of experience, he might have been speculating outcomes, but he wouldn't have been able to speak to them at that time.
Okay. So, and your husband, Ben, did he have you talked to him about like what he thought was going on during that time? Because obviously it's like being the person that is giving birth, you really do kind of sometimes dissociate and just like, I'm just doing what I need to do. And I cannot, like, everything is either super fast or super slow. So you're kind of out of it. Did he pay attention to
like looking back, I still have never like talked to him about like his experience in that like hour of time. And I talked I went to therapy, which we'll talk about later, but I talked to my therapist a lot about how I held a lot of things out of like trying to protect I didn't want to bring things up I was feeling because I didn't want him to like start feeling those things if he wasn't.
Yeah.
And he very much likes to like move forward. And so I've never like dug into that hour of time with him. There are other times where I like through our journey where I asked him like, did you know that this is what that meant? Based on some of like the vocabulary they used and things like that.
Yeah.
That he had more insight to than I did. But in that like delivery time, I've never like dug into with him.
Okay. Yeah. And that is hard because it is yeah, like there's got to be some major trauma that happened in that hour of time. Like
I remember after she was born, even before like knowing what the next weeks would bring, I turned to my husband and I was like, I'm going to therapy after this. I need to go to therapy and you probably do too. And we were both just like, yeah, that would be beneficial.
Yeah.
Just like knowing, just with a psychology background, I was like, this was a lot of trauma.
Yeah.
I'm going to need to work through this at some point.
Yep. Okay. Thanks for answering those questions for me. And then going back to when you guys were at the University of Iowa, so you weren't able to hold her. What were the EEGs were saying about her activity? So they were not seeing necessarily seizures, but any other, I mean, I'm assuming they were. Oh, go ahead.
They really were just monitoring seizure activity.
Oh, it was. Okay.
Yep. And she didn't have any seizure activity during the like cooling phase, which is 72 hours. There were a lot of things during that time period. They were that were very positive. The fact that like her body, the rest of her organs were working. She wasn't having any like heart concerns. She was like having wet diapers and like poopy diapers. And so like her body was working.
Yeah.
They didn't have there weren't any other like big
Okay.
things that came up. It really was just her brain.
Yeah.
And they kept the EEGs, on her through the cooling. And then after they're cooled, they warm their body back up.
Okay.
And they kept them on her through the warming phase because they said that a lot of times that's when they'll start to see the seizure activity as things are waking up and
Oh,
things are
gotcha.
firing more.
Yeah.
So they leave them on, even though they hadn't seen anything, they didn't want to take them off in case they started to.
Mm-hmm.
But otherwise, during that like 72 hours, I got to Iowa City Thursday, like mid-afternoon.
Okay.
So the cooling was set to end like in the middle of the night, like 3 a.m. on Sunday morning or something like that.
Okay.
And during that time, we had just so many people reach out to us with like hopeful stories. Like, I know somebody whose daughter suffered this injury and now they're typically developing, or we have an extended family member whose daughter suffered an HIE injury and she has difficulties, but she's still here with them and still growing and just started first grade. And so like we really held on to those stories just to like get us through that waiting period.
Yeah. Okay. And we're at this time where they were basically just saying, we're waiting. We just have to see how she does.
Waiting. The first, so in Iowa City, they do like 2-week rotations, the neonatologists do.
Okay.
And so when we first got there, we had the neonatologist days before it switched to someone else. And this guy, when he first talked to Ben, he was the first one to say that usually with these oxygen levels that like Camie's blood showed, it's a significant injury that we're going to be dealing with. We're going to be talking about like severe impacts. We don't know until we like do the MRI after she's warmed, but in my experience, like this is going to be a significant impact on her.
Okay.
And so my husband didn't tell me that right away, but sometime before she was warmed, he told me, and I just kind of ignored it.
Yeah.
I didn't want to like think about the bad things that could happen.
Yeah. I mean that changes so much, that's going to change the way your life looks considerably. Like,
right.
Okay, so she was starting to be warmed on Sunday,
Yeah.
early morning, essentially, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. And all that is they just like take away the cooling pad that she's on and turn on like the heating lamps that newborns are usually under to help them and start slowly warming her up. And she warmed up to like 96, 97 degrees really quickly.
Okay.
And then those last 2 degrees just like wouldn't warm up the rest of the way. They give them 24 hours is what they give for the warming period. And if they're not quite at 98 by then, they just say they're basically warm enough. Like that's just where their body's going to go.
Okay.
So we got to that 24-hour mark before they were like, yeah, she's warm basically. And so that was sometime Monday afternoon. We were hoping it was going to be early enough on Monday that they could then do the MRI. So after the warming for babies with these injuries, they do an MRI of the brain to see where the damage occurred.
Yeah.
We were hoping, or maybe it did happen on Monday. It did. They did. They took her down for an MRI on Monday, but it was later in the afternoon. We were hoping it was going to be earlier so that we could then get the results on Monday still.
Have it read. Yeah. Okay.
Yep. And I just remember on that Monday, my parents really wanted to come down and see her, but I had told them, like, no, that's MRI day. Like, there's a lot going on. We don't know what her schedule is going to be. Like, it's not good for us. Like, we're very nervous about this. And I felt bad for that because I am like a take care of other people's feelings. But this whole time and whole like process made me like have to put us and like our kids and our family first. And so there were a lot of times that was hard through the journey where I felt like I was hurting other people because of what I needed to do to take care of our family. And that was one of them. But I wouldn't have changed. It would have been an awful day for them to come. And it was always such a juggle too, because we could only have, like I said, the 2 people in her room a day.
Anytime. Yeah.
Yeah. And so with both of us, like, we didn't want to be those people trying to break all the rules all the time.
Yeah. Oh, and can I ask you, it sounds like she was kind of in her own separate area, because sometimes NICU, they're kind of in the same big room or something like that. So
no. So at the University of Iowa, they have 5 different bays
Okay.
that they call Bay 1 being the most like significant needs, all the way up to, and I don't know if they call it Bay 5, but it's in like the new children's hospital on their own floor.
Okay.
So maybe like you get progressively less sick as you go up the bays. And if you're going into like Bay 3 and 4, that's usually when you're working towards discharge and plan for going home.
Gotcha.
That was one thing that stood out to me one of the first times walking into the NICU. Bay 1 is the neonatal critical care unit. And so I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, this is pretty significant. Like she's very sick.
Yeah.
And it was crazy because most of the other babies in that bay are like your micro preemies. Like they are teeny tiny, born
Yeah.
super early
Yeah.
in dark rooms, like no stimulation. And then Camie, who seems like a giant to all these other babies, even the nurses, they're like, I'm going to call someone else to help me move her because we're not used to this, like with such a big baby. And we're like, she's not that big.
Yeah, that's so funny how
like
the
such a
comparison.
different experience. But yeah, we had our own room.
Okay.
And we were fortunate to have a couch and a chair. So if we were like both there sleeping, we could make it work.
Yeah.
It had like sliding doors so you could like close off the outside a little bit. And then at first she was on like 1-to-1. So she had only like one nurse was just taking care of her when they were on shift. And then eventually it switched, I think, to 1-to-2. So maybe one nurse was looking at 2 babies.
Yeah. Okay.
But in that bay, it's very like individualized care. For them.
That's good. Yeah. Okay, so she got the MRI on Monday, but it sounds like it was a little bit too late for them to have read it / got the results.
Like a whole process to like get her on the traveling vent, take her on what they would call a field trip to wherever they go and do the MRI, get on the MRI vent, get off. And so it was like a 2 or 2.5 hour process. Whoa, so it was late afternoon before she was back in her room and settled. And so even though we were hopeful we'd see her neurology team, we didn't talk to them until Tuesday.
Okay. And so you guys just stayed that night?
Yep. So we both stayed, I think pretty early in those days. We have friends who have had babies in the NICU in Iowa City who were like giving us recommendations on, like, they have a Ronald McDonald house. So we got a room there, and we often took like, in those days when we were just staying in Iowa City, we would take turns going to like sleep at the Ronald McDonald house to actually sleep in a bed.
Yeah.
But had one of us at the hospital all the time. Eventually we kind of shifted how we were doing things so we could also be home with Hallie.
Oh, good.
But in those first days, we were both in Iowa City the whole time.
And Hallie's with your in-laws at that time still, yes?
I think my parents maybe came down and were with her that weekend.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay.
I can't remember for sure the switch, but I'm pretty sure, because that's why I think that's why they wanted to come visit Monday, because they were leaving to go home and thought they could come and see Camie first and then go home.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay. And then so she is so yeah, let's talk about when the MRI is finally, you guys discussed that with the
team. Tuesday morning they do what's called, the whole team like comes together, which is like the dietitian, the neonatologist, the nurse, the respiratory therapist, like anybody that might be supporting care for that baby comes together at the end of the hallway and does rounds where everyone just updates, like, this is what their feeds are, this is this, like all the things that maybe changed in the last day. And as parents, you're always invited to go to those, which is what you just walk out and go stand at the end of the hall with them. Like it seems like such a funny place to hold these things. And Ben didn't go. He had it was hard going to rounds. They didn't talk about like the specific parts of like her injury or specific parts of the baby's sickness. It was always like more positive than maybe it always felt more positive than maybe your situation was.
Yeah.
But that's, I think, why I liked going to them, because it gave me a little bit more hope. And so he didn't go with me down to rounds on Tuesday, I remember. But I went, and I just remember, I don't ever remember the specifics of things they said. I just remember that they didn't say anything about like having the MRI done, anything about the results, which I was like, well, if it was better news, I feel like they would have said something about it. And then the neonatologist who we had been with that day before, and that day, maybe like she had just switched, came in after our like update. She said that the neurology team would be coming to like talk to us about the results soon.
Okay. Okay.
So then we just sat in our room waiting. We were so anxious about like what they were gonna say, what the results were gonna be. And it was early, had to have been early afternoon. I felt like we were waiting a long time, but it really wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
And the neurologist, she was maybe one of my favorite doctors, only because she was the one that would be honest, but also like hopeful about her previous experiences with like these injuries or whatever. So she came in with, I feel like she had a fellow, she had like so many people came in. And then the palliative care team came in too, which at first I was kind of taken aback by. I didn't know why
Yeah.
they were there. I didn't really know what they were either at that time.
Okay.
And that's when she basically said the injury was significant, as lots of people predicted. It occurred in her basal ganglia, which is essentially the communication center between the body's like muscular movement system and the brain.
Yeah.
She said, although there's no guarantee, often when she sees baby with this type of injury, you're looking at eventual like cerebral palsy diagnoses, unsure on what she'll be able to see or hear, unsure about like feeding things in the future. Oh, she also had an NG tube.
Oh, okay.
I don't remember if she got that in Waterloo or when she got to Iowa City, but that's
Gotcha.
how she was getting like nutrition at some point. I don't know when they started that. And so she kind of confirmed what everyone had been maybe preparing us for, but we weren't ready to accept or prepare for. And that was really, that's the big things I remember from the conversation. I don't remember, I feel like it was maybe in that conversation where they gave us information on an international group called Hope for HIE, which is just a big organization supporting families, advocating for research on these HIE injuries, all sorts of things. But so I started kind of looking into that, but really like that's the impacts of that conversation that I remember. I'm sure there was maybe more details shared. She talked about, and I feel like at that time, sometime during the warming, Camie did start to show seizure activity.
Oh.
And I can't remember if it was this conversation or another one where they had talked about enrolling her in a research study for a seizure medication, Vimpat or lacosamide, either name. And at first, me and my husband were like, well, we don't really want her on this like testing drug. And then we were asking, because we're like, we want to make sure like she's getting what she needs.
Right.
But then when I was like asking more questions about it, it's a medication that had been approved down to 1 month of age or older. They were just now testing it on like neonates.
Right.
And it has been shown to have less side effects than like Keppra, which is a very like sedative, heavy duty, like seizure medication. And they wanted to try and avoid some of those. So we got her started, and I don't remember if it was before this conversation or during, but got her started on that medication that ended up working really well for her. Like she responded very quickly to it.
Oh, okay.
And so they just kept her on. We didn't try anything else. They just kept her on that seizure medication that she stayed on through her life too.
Okay. And she did, but she did still continue to have seizures. I mean, throughout.
So we must have started this when she was in the warming because she still had the EEG on.
Okay.
But as soon as they started this trial medication, they stopped.
Okay.
And then they took off all the
after
EEG.
the time. Okay.
Yep, and they never put them back on. So.
Okay. And is she okay? So that was the impact of that conversation. But then what did they say about like what were the next steps? Did they say anything about that, or was it like more of a waiting game?
I feel like it was probably that same day, and maybe it was with the palliative care team in that same like conversation time. We started talking about kind of like, like what's our plan? Like how do we just sit in here forever? Like what are our goals? And basically the goals were to figure out how to feed her and to get her off the vent. Like those were our big things to go home.
Right.
And actually when she was cooled, she was breathing over the vent. And so because I remember them talking about how if she wasn't cooled, they'd be extubating her. But because they knew we had to go through the warming and that can throw things off, they didn't want to extubate her in case it caused problems.
Okay.
So she stayed on the vent because after she was warmed, they did have to up the support some.
Gotcha.
And she wasn't like as confident with her breathing, you could say. It took her a little while to like build
To
up
kind
the
of get back to,
stamina.
okay.
Yeah.
So you guys needed to learn how to feed her? I mean, or like, how was that
So,
conversation? I'm so curious about that. That's like
yeah,
interesting.
I was really kind of confused too on like what this, like ultimately, like the goal would have been to get to a point where she could either take a bottle or like nurse.
Right.
I think though pretty quickly, like we realized that was like and I think the team probably realized like that's not going to be her reality given her injury.
Yeah.
She wasn't demonstrating that she had like the suck and swallow reflex at all. Wasn't really demonstrating that she had much of a gag reflex. And so we didn't help with any of the feedings until we were really getting close to discharge, but it was just all tube feeds
Tube
through her
feeds. Okay.
NG tube. Yeah.
Okay. And that is a whole different little, like, that is very complicated. It's not an
Yeah.
easy thing to make sure those are clear and she's getting what she needs to get. And so, okay. And then did she finally start also breathing a little bit better?
So that week that followed the MRI results was pretty uneventful. She ended up going down. At some point, I had asked if she would ever have like a repeat MRI, knowing how much how much developing and growing the baby's brain needs to do. And they just kept talking about like read to her, talk to her, like encourage all these connections to form to help the brain as much. And so I just remember asking like, will she ever have another MRI so we can like see if there's been progress?
Yeah.
And I still don't really understand why, but they're like, no, I mean, not really. We know where the damage is. Now you just like do your best to improve outcomes, essentially, which I get. But also I was like, I want to know, like, if, like, what out, like, are we really making a difference? But
Yeah.
she ended up having a second MRI, not to look at like the brain, the injury, but in her first one, they had noticed a brain bleed or a few brain bleeds. And so they wanted to do an MRI more specifically looking at that.
Yeah.
They ended up being like not impactful, not something they were worried about, just something that they were like keeping an eye on for like signs that it might be causing problems, but it was never something that was like,
huge
followed up on again.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. And so then it sounded like you guys were like finally starting to go back home so that you could see Hallie. So tell me like how you guys and like
so after
so that first week, right? That first week
yeah,
is so long.
I know.
Sure.
Yeah. So many happened in those like first 4 or 5 days. So that next like full week after we got the MRI results, I also just remember thinking, so I work in like the world of special ed. As a school psychologist, I work with the special ed population, which is sometimes misleading on my name. I'm not a school counselor. But my brain immediately, I was like, I know who we need to get connected with to start getting like early intervention services. And I know like, I was like thinking like our house, we live in like a 1-story house. I'm like, okay, like we're accessible, like thinking, I was just like thinking of all these things that we were going to need to prepare for in our life.
Yeah.
I also was like thinking on we started like just worrying about, because I had her in March, my plan was to be off the rest of the school year for maternity leave.
Yeah.
And then like, oh my gosh, do I go back to work in the fall or do we try and get like like we just started to have those like that we could not even like begin to try and answer at the time. But those are the things we started thinking about. But after we got through the big like MRI and everything, we started alternating nights at home. So Ben would come home, pick Hallie up from daycare, take her home and spend the night with her, take her back to daycare in the morning, and then drive down to Iowa City. And we would spend the day kind of together. And then I would leave and pick Hallie up from daycare and like just back and forth with that until like something else came up or changed that we both wanted to be in Iowa City for.
Yeah. That's so, poor Hallie. I just think of like, that is hard. That's hard on both of you guys and Hallie. I think
when I think back to that, I think because she was so young, it almost helped because she didn't understand. And like, it really wasn't after, especially once that week started where we were alternating. When she was home, she was with one of us, which really wasn't that different for her.
That's true. Yeah.
And so I think like her being so young during that time, I think was better for her than like if something were to happen now where she is
It's
a
very
lot more aware and understanding and those types of things. At this point, I don't even know if she like, I mean, we would FaceTime so she could see Camie, but I don't think she even realized like, oh, that's my sister. She's just like, oh, it's a baby. I love babies. Like she's so cute type of thing.
Yeah.
Um,
yeah. It's
but
so hard
yeah,
though.
that first full week, by the end of the week, and I think it would have been this week. The neonatologist towards the end came in, and I feel like there were things said throughout the week, but Camie wasn't really like waking up as much as they would have hoped. She wasn't moving as much as they would have hoped. She wasn't like responding to things. Her eyes opened pretty early on after warming. But she wasn't doing a lot of moving around that they were hoping to see. They started, and these are like some of the words that I picked up on, but like chose not to look into what they meant because I knew it probably wasn't great. But they're the things that like my husband picked up on and knew what they meant. But the neonatologist started like saying that she was seeing posturing. And but then the neurologist would come and like do her checks. She's like, I'm not seeing this posturing that doctor, I don't even remember her name, was talking about, but like I do see block movements, like her arms would only move together. And she's like, but that's just like reality because of her injury. It's what you would expect. So it was almost hard because we'd hear like her general NICU team say these things that were maybe concerning, but then her neurologist would come and be like, this is what I would expect. Like she's doing what I think she should be doing given like her reality. So it was kind of hard who to like hang on to, like what to really, I don't want to say believe, but like lean into, I guess. But by the end of, I think it was Friday, so we'd been there just over a week, her neonatologist came in, and I think maybe the nurse at that time, I can't remember if anybody else was in there too, and sat down, and she just explained that Camie wasn't really showing the progress that they would like to see, that they expected to see. And I don't remember all the things that were said, except that we needed to make decisions on what we wanted her life to look like. And I just remember first I was so confused. I'm like, what does that mean? Here I was like preparing for a life of potential probable like disabilities. And what do you mean? What do we want her life to look like? And she kept like trying to explain it, but I couldn't like grasp. I just could not grasp what she was getting at. And I looked at her and I asked, is she going to die? And her response was, as long as she stays hooked up to the vent, as long as she is here, she's doing great. You need to decide if that's what you want her life to look like. Hooked up to machines to keep her alive, dependent on you for that's when I grasped it. I was like, okay. And basically was getting into, we needed to decide, did we want Camie to stay hooked up to a vent if like when we got to the point of extubating her, it failed? And like, do we want to have her on a DNR, a do not resuscitate, or do we want to reintubate her, keep her alive type of thing? And so she left with these like ginormous decisions that we had to make. And almost immediately, we didn't even have to talk about it. We agreed that we didn't want, if her life meant being hooked up to a vent 100% dependent on us for everything, that's not what we wanted for her. We didn't think, like neither one of us, if that's what our lives came to, would want to continue living our life like that. And we both know that. And we didn't think that that was really a life for Camie. So we agreed pretty quickly that once we got to the point of extubating her, if it didn't go well, we weren't going to have the team reintubate her. We were just going to let that be the end of her life. We also had to make decisions on like feeding and medications. And ultimately, like we decided we're going to feed her as long as that's what her body needs. Cause some like when people are towards their end of life and they're maybe on hospice care, sometimes their body's just not like processing that anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
And so we had agreed that as long as that's like what her body needed and she was benefiting from it, we were going to keep feeding her. And the same things like medication and doctor's appointments and stuff. If she got a cold and just needed some antibiotics, we're not going to not give her antibiotics because
Yes.
that's not a huge intervention.
Yeah.
If it just came to the point where they needed to like intubate her or do life-saving measures, that's what we didn't want for her.
Right.
And so after we made that decision, then they kind of broke the rules for us. They told us we could have whoever come visit that we wanted to. So then my parents came down to meet her. My husband, Ben's parents, came to see her. My sister came down. All of my like brother and sister-in-laws, they all came to meet her. And they had said, and I feel bad about this, but when we really talked about it, but they had said that the nurses were very good. Like anytime we wanted to hold her, which we back up a little bit, we finally got to do once she was
Okay.
warmed. We
Yeah.
finally got to hold her for the first time, which was
Yeah.
like so terrifying. You're afraid to move because they're hooked up to all of
So many
these things.
Yeah.
But it was also like so great. And once they got the EEGs off of her, it was a little more flexible because they weren't worried about like jostling and messing up everything.
Yeah.
But still with the vent, you're like, I
Yeah.
don't want this to like stab her lung or something.
Yeah.
And then it involved like, you always kind of felt bad because the nurses had to come and like move her to
Do
you
all the
and
things,
hook
yeah.
it up. And so it was just such a process. And it always took Camie a little while to settle in after moving. So even though the nurses were so good and said that they'd let anybody, like they would switch her as many times as they needed to, we had decided, we felt like it was best to not like put her through so much stuff.
Yeah.
Sometimes I kind of feel bad about that. But again, one of those decisions where we felt like it was best for her.
Yeah.
Even if that meant some of our family never got to hold her, type of thing. So that next week, it was, I think maybe every day we had somebody coming to visit, which was also kind of nice. But it was also, I don't want to say boring, but NICU life is very boring. Like you just sit in there and you listen to the beeping
Yep.
and alarms of everything and go for a walk every once in a while. And it was hard to balance like being there, but also like it's okay to take time away and not be there 100% of the time. But I always just felt guilty if one of us wasn't there.
Yeah.
But for us, like our sanity, it was important, like for both of us to go and eat together somewhere or
Yes.
to like take a break outside of the hospital. So we had people pretty much in and out through most of that next week. So now we're 2 full weeks into the hospital, stay in Iowa City. And then that next weekend was Easter weekend. And we had kind of decided when we made the decision that once we extubate her, we're just going to see what happens. And I think everyone felt pretty optimistic because by that time where we were having that conversation, she was on pretty minimal vent support. She was breathing over it at times.
Okay.
It was really like her carbon dioxide levels were sometimes a little bit high.
Okay.
But overall, everybody, I don't think anybody expected it to go poorly, but they did prepare us that they had like one of the other neonatologists who I think was like, we never met with him, but our doctor like consulted with him. He did say that he's had babies where everything was complete. Like they didn't expect anything to go wrong. Then they took the vent out and then the baby passed. So they like did prepare us for that to be the situation, which we like had accepted that it might be.
Okay.
But our plan was, so the Monday after Easter, April 18th, I think by this point, we were going to extubate her. And then our goal was to get home. We didn't want to like take the vent out and then get home just to say we got home. We wanted to make sure she was stable enough that we would actually get home.
Yeah.
And so everyone had kind of said like 48 hours to like give her time to adjust. So we could do like the car seat test. We could learn how to do her feeds, was kind of our game plan. So Monday, I still don't know why I expected like this huge fanfare of team to come in for this extubation because we knew like if something happened, they weren't going to do anything.
Yeah.
So it was just our nurse and the respiratory therapist, and they were mostly just there to take the equipment out of the room.
Yeah.
But they just pulled her tube out. She got the hiccups right away. They suctioned her out some to like clear the gunk out. And then they just monitor her like for intervals to make sure her color stays good, that she's breathing. And that was it. It was like the most anticlimactic event ever, but it was, I mean, in a good way because nothing happened.
Nothing happened. She did okay.
Yeah. And so that day she got to move from like the warming NICU bed to like an actual crib. She just had, she had her pull socks on because that just has to be on while she's in the hospital. And she had her NG tube And then the only other support that she, besides her seizure med, was like suction because she couldn't like swallow and clear her secretions on her own.
Yeah. Okay.
But otherwise, that was all that she had and continued to need for the rest of her life. So we just learned how to do her feeds,
Okay.
which that in itself wasn't super stressful. It was like if she pulls out her tube, they like taught us how to put it back in, and that was stressful. Like, what if it goes in her
Yeah.
lung? Like, I was very worried about that. That did happen it didn't go in her, she just pulled it out a couple times.
Okay.
And then it ended up being, we ended up staying more like 72 hours,
Okay.
but she made it through the car seat test. And then Thursday was the day that we ended up going home. And it was great and terrifying at the
Yes,
same
I was gonna be
time.
saying, I was like, oh man, that drive would have been like, oh, okay, she okay?
Yeah. And so we came home with a suction machine, and then
Okay.
we came home with like a pulse ox, a hospital grade pulse ox
Oh,
monitor.
good.
They had talked about some people want it, some people don't, because some people like obsess over the numbers. So it measured her heart rate and her O2 levels is all that it was giving us. But we decided we were more comforted by it because it was, if her O2 started dropping, then it was a clear sign like that she needed to like help clearing out, like needed to be suctioned.
Mm-hmm.
And so we relied on that to help us tell, like, just if she needed something, if
Yeah,
she wasn't
okay.
comfortable, because she didn't cry like a baby usually does. She didn't react like a baby usually does. So we just didn't feel like we were going to learn her cues for if she needed something otherwise.
Gotcha.
But yeah, we got home. My mother-in-law was home or at our house. I think Hallie was at daycare. But our mother-in-law, she had started some supper for us to have,
Yeah.
had been there. We have 2 dogs too. So that was always a shuffle too, with just making sure that
They were
they were
taken.
taken
Yeah.
care of. And I think one of them actually went and basically lived at our in-laws' house
Oh.
for this time, just to make things easier, because
Yeah.
our dogs don't get along. And so that always makes things
Oh.
more complicated for
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
But yeah, we got home and unpacked and just, I think we're both kind of like, okay, here we are, we're doing
Yeah.
this. Like, oh my
Yeah.
gosh, it's a little scary.
Yeah.
But yeah, we went and got Hallie, and she was just like immediately like so in love with her, wanted to like
Oh.
hold her all the time. She never showed like any signs of jealousy. She just always wanted to like be with Camie and
Oh.
share all of her toys with her and cover
How
her up
sweet.
and cuddle her, and was just like the sweetest from day one.
That is so cute.
Camie was on every 3 hours. She had feeds, and then 3 times a day we had to give her seizure medication. So pretty quickly we got into a routine where Ben would stay up through like her 9 p.m. and midnight feed, and then I would wake up for the 3 a.m.
Gotcha.
and then kind
just
of like
from
stay
there on.
awake.
Yeah. Okay.
And then try and take a nap, like when Hallie was taking a nap. And Ben was home for a week. He was lucky that he either had the days off or guys like worked for him without
That's
him having
awesome.
to for
Yeah.
that whole like month of April, because that
Oh,
was
man.
another thing. We're like,
How's this gonna work?
we have no idea how long we're going to
Yeah.
be in the hospital. What are we going to do on the days that you're on shift and you
Yeah.
can't be down here for 2 nights, but then you won't see Hallie at all if you do come down here on your night off. And so thankfully we never had to get that figured out. We were in Iowa City for exactly 3 weeks before we came home.
Wow, that is okay. And so when you did get home, she was about 3-ish weeks,
Yep.
almost 4 weeks.
Yeah, like 3 weeks in a day, basically.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, and so gosh, that is a really complicated schedule for you guys. Like, yeah, you're right. That's a lot of like, okay, you do these ones, and
yeah.
And how did she do when she got home? Like, tell me about
She,
how that started.
Good as
far
as we could tell. After we were
Yeah.
home a few days, it was one evening and she kind of like yelled out.
Oh.
I remember looking at Ben and I was like, I think she maybe cried. Maybe it was like her cry. And then we like soon discovered that it must have been because every night she did get like the typical like newborn like witching hour from like 7 to 9, would just be like almost in like just yelling and like crying the whole time. which was
So
like kind of nice to have
interesting.
like that
Yeah.
normal newborn, but it was also like a little stressful because we're like, I don't like, I
What?
can't, you're not quite the same. And I don't want you to be so upset. And,
Yeah.
but yeah, so she did start crying. She still never cried like if she was hungry or if something hurt. We never knew that, but
Yeah.
like that chunk of time, she would cry.
Yeah. I mean, yes, you're right. It probably would be so reassuring in that sense. And you feel like that's a little bit more of normal baby
Hmm.
behavior. But also, yeah,
Yeah.
you're like, what do you need? Like with every newborn,
Right.
what do you need?
Hmm.
Okay. So yeah, tell me a little bit more about how she progressed.
Yeah, so we came home. I guess part of us coming home, we also set up hospice care. We were in this really weird
Okay.
limbo, it felt like, because we
Yeah.
were coming home with the support of hospice care. But we also had a palliative care team in Iowa City
Yeah.
that was like her care team to maintain
Yeah.
her, basically.
Mm-hmm.
But then we're home with hospice care. And then eventually they started talking about us taking her to our like normal pediatrician.
Oh,
And so it was this very weird place of like,
yeah.
who do I call if I have questions, or who do I need to talk to about this? And
Yeah.
we didn't get a lot of opportunity to figure all that out, but our hospice, so the day we came home, our hospice team, which was the nurse and the social worker, came over to like meet us and set up
Mm-hmm.
a
Mm-hmm.
schedule. And so we had set up that our hospice nurse would come on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays just to check in. And she basically asked us if we had any concerns, would check like breathing and heart rate.
Mm-hmm.
It was often a very short visit.
Yeah.
And she was great. But yeah, and nothing ever really came up. We tried to get out. Thankfully, it was like a really nice May. We
Hmm.
tried to get outside and just be outside when we could. My friends were really good. So we came home on April 21st, I think. My birthday
Uh-huh.
was April 29th,
Oh,
my
uh-huh.
30th birthday.
Mm-hmm.
And so my friends were really good. And that was the first day that Ben went back to work too. But they were so good and
Oh,
came over like that evening, like made supper and just hung out.
yeah.
Um, and then it was very nice of like my brother and his mom, but they had talked about basically my mother-in-law being at our house on the days my husband was on shift, because he was just really worried about me having to balance both kids on
Right.
my own,
Right.
which I
Right.
was
Right.
nervous about. But I don't like people in my space,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't like getting help from people. I like to just figure things out on my own.
Yeah.
And I'm very much like that person who is, I'm tired of being the only one that cleans the house, but also you're not cleaning the house the right way. So I'm just going to do it anyway.
Yes. Yes. I
um,
understand you.
and so I was like, Ben, I don't want your mom here. And
Yeah.
no, like nothing bad towards my
Not
mother-in-law.
exactly.
I needed to like know if we could do this on our own.
Right.
And so she came over that night to help get through like that first night on my own. But after that, I was like, let me at least try it on my
Yeah.
own. Worst
Yeah.
case scenario, I'm just up all night and then Ben has to come home so I can sleep the next day.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it worked out fine.
Okay.
I just slept in between. One thing that was hard, because she wasn't like a normal newborn, you wouldn't know if she was awake. And so that was something I really had a
Oh.
hard time with. Like I felt bad sleeping, not knowing if she was just laying there awake, like by herself.
Yeah.
And so there were a lot of times I didn't sleep, and I felt that in the hospital too. But there were a
Yeah.
lot of times where I didn't sleep very well because I'm like, oh, she's awake right now. I need to be awake, even though she wasn't crying like a baby would if they were awake, or
Right.
wasn't like fussing,
Yeah.
but she was still awake. And so I tried really hard to still like be awake with her if she was awake. I know it couldn't have happened all the time because you didn't always know if she was awake, but that was
Yeah.
something that was really hard for me to like
Yeah.
accept or try and like balance, because I just felt sad for her in that way.
Yeah. I mean, because when they're awake, you're always like either playing with them or doing tummy time or
Right.
whatever. And
Yep.
yeah, that would make my heart sad
Yeah.
about that. Oh.
Yeah. Otherwise, so early access is like the program in Iowa that gets support for like the birth to 3 age
Yeah.
range.
Okay.
And so Iowa City had put in a referral for us. So it would have actually been like my employer is who I would have
Yeah.
reached out to. It just would have been a team I don't work with. But they actually contacted us first, which was nice. Like, even though I knew how to go about things, it was nice not having to. So having like the hospital really figured out, like got
Good.
hospice set up for us, got that referral in, like all of those things. So pretty quickly we had our first like visit with them.
Mhm.
And it was all virtual except for the physical therapist. She did come over to like
Eh,
meet Camie and get an idea of what she needed.
yeah.
And then they like did their end of things like paperwork wise
Mhm.
and evaluation stuff wise on their end in the following weeks. But otherwise, it was just really like uneventful,
Yeah.
getting into the swing of things. We had like some friends and families stop by here and there to like, we have some aunts that make quilts for the babies. And so they would stop by and drop the quilts off. Or I did I don't like I said, I don't like asking for help, but people would ask like, what can they do? And I quickly accepted that I can tell people to do supper for us would just like take so much off my plate, like bring meals. So we had some people
Exactly.
bring meals for
Great.
us,
Yeah. Good.
which was just like great to not have to worry about those like day-to-day things
Mhm.
when you're
Yep.
just like surviving in the
Yeah.
moment.
You're like trying to figure out, it's a really new normal, like just what you were talking
Yeah.
about. I was like, that is a lot of work, a lot of work.
Hmm.
And you're sleep
Yeah.
deprived too. Like there's
Right.
just so many levels there.
But yeah, otherwise, besides just like adjusting, we kept having conversations about it was so hard because everyone kept talking about how Camie's stable, but we still knew like we're still on hospice care and we
Yeah.
still know that her life isn't going to be as long as we want it. We just don't know how long that's going to be.
Right.
So it was so hard to have conversations about the future.
Yeah.
And the biggest one just at that time being my job, knowing I'm supposed to go back to
Mm,
work in August and had signed my contract in March for the next year. I mean, knowing I could have gotten out of it, but like just trying to wrap our heads around like, do I try and work? But then we have to try and find like either a babysitter that's comfortable because she wasn't like an intense medical need, but you
right.
still like had to be comfortable with the feeds and
Hmm.
getting medication, or like do we figure out if we qualify for like in-home nursing type of stuff and then finding somebody if we even do, because that's
That,
always a challenge.
yes.
And so it was about a month later. So we're into May now.
Hmm.
We had done a few. We have some really close family friends from my hometown who I like babysat all while they were
Oh,
young and growing
uh-huh.
up. And their second oldest had his grad party, and I really wanted to go to it. So my husband was on shift, and traveling alone with Camie we didn't do it just because the position of the car seat, she always needed like more suction because it wasn't we always had her on her
No.
side. So
Yeah.
like her secretions could kind of drain better.
Yeah.
And so the car, it never seemed very comfortable for her. So we always like to have at least two adults. So one could like watch her and then one
Sure.
could drive.
Yeah.
So my parents came and picked me and the kids up, and we went up to Charles City and made it to the grad party, which was like so exhausting and like stressful to like do it, but I'm glad that we did.
Good. Yeah.
Um, and then they brought me back home with the kids. And then, yeah, I don't know, that was sometime in early
Okay.
mid-May, maybe. Um, but then I'm kind of moving to like the end of things now. So is there
Okay.
anything else you want me to talk
Yeah.
about?
It's just, that's good to know that there's, like, I don't think people realize because we don't actually get, this is a very unusual story. Like,
Hmm.
Cammie's story is a little unusual because a lot of these babies kind of pass away very, very quickly, and having
Yeah.
to navigate, right? This is a
Hmm.
whole new world that you guys were looking at. And um just interesting that you're like, yeah, we need two people to take her on a trip.
Hmm.
Like, that's not something that's just super easy. So just wanted to make a comment that this is just
Yeah.
super unusual and a lot of logistics that would need to be
Hmm.
discussed and figured
Yeah.
out in this time. So yes, go ahead. So you can, yeah, go on then.
Yeah. So when we were discharged from Iowa City, we were set up, like our follow-up appointments were set up for like May 20th, I want to say.
In Iowa
And
City at
yep, in
that
Iowa
okay.
City. So
Great.
it was going to be like with her neurologist, with her palliative care team, and then with nutrition.
Okay.
And then we had further appointments set up in June for like GI, which would have been the appointment where we talked about getting a G tube
Gr-
versus like the NG.
yeah.
The NG, she had a lot of like spit up kind of,
Mm.
and it was explained because the tube kind of keeps that sphincter open a little bit. And so we really
Yes.
struggled a lot with it always like coming back up. So we were kind of anxious to like get rid of the NG tube, really.
Yeah.
We felt like she would be more comfortable without it. So we got to that, it was a Friday, and Ben and I both went down. And overall, it was like a pretty positive appointment. Everyone described her as stable. Her neurologist said that she's a warrior. The only thing that we were changing was her nutritionist. She was gaining weight, but not like quite at the rate they would like to see.
Okay.
And then we talked about how like she spits up so much, and they were like, well, do you think she can take more volume? And because so much was coming up, I didn't feel like she could take more volume. So then we started, because she was getting breast milk. So we started fortifying it with formula to just get more calories in the food she was getting. And then her neurologist was going to start her on, I don't remember the name of it. We never started it, but a medication. She was starting to get really tight. Like her muscles were getting really tight, and she was like just really tense.
Like she would kind of grip up or something?
Yeah, like her hands were always very like tight. Her arms were always like turned in and tight. So we were always like trying to stretch her out and like move her body, because she was just very like tensed up all the time, which is something that they said could happen with just because of her injury and to watch out for. So we talked about that at our appointment, and we're going to start her on a medication to help with that, to help her relax more. So we got home from that, and that Sunday, like May 22nd, again, we had another grad party for a family friend. And this time, like our whole family got to go out on like a family outing to this grad party. And we stopped there's another firefighter who they have horses. And so we stopped at their house on the way home to like see the horses and just hang out with them for a little bit. And then we went home, and that Monday, and sometime in that last week leading up to Camie's appointments with our hospice nurse, we had been talking about decreasing the amount of her visits too, because in their eyes, she was stable. In everyone's eyes, she was stable. That Monday, I'm trying to think, I think Monday, everything was okay. The rest of us had kind of been fighting a cold, like nothing serious, but we kind of had a cold the like few days before. And I was a little bit worried on how that might impact Camie, but she wasn't like showing signs of being sick. We would check her temperature every once in a while just to make sure we weren't missing something. And she never had a temp. And that Monday night, I'm trying to think if Ben was on shift.
She probably couldn't.
So
she probably couldn't. She didn't really have a cough, right? Like she could never cough herself, right?
No.
Okay.
No. And so, that was another hard thing. Like, how are we ever going to know if she's sick, if she needs something? It was very like, that was a stress always like in the back of your mind. Like, am I missing something?
Right.
But you just like, we just went off of what we knew, and nothing ever like dramatically changed. That Monday night, I think my husband was maybe on shift, because I just remember that I was up a lot more with her in the night, which being up with Camie just meant that her like monitor, it kept like her levels kept going low enough that it would alert you. And so I just remember in the night, it kept going off a lot more than it usually would. So I was just up with her, like checking on her a lot, suctioning her out a lot more. She just seemed a lot more restless that night.
Okay.
And so,
but her heart rate, her O2 sats would just drop.
It was mostly her O2.
O2, okay.
Go. And I think 85 is what it was set at. So below 85 oxygen, which is, I mean, kind of low, but not like crazy. And then it would go back. It wouldn't ever like stay down there for very long, but it just like was frequent through the night. And that next day, I don't remember if Ben went to work, like construction something, or if he was home. But I remember calling him and talking to him about it, and just like wondering if he thought there was something I should do, and he was like, does she have a fever? And she didn't. And we were just kind of like, okay, we're just going to see. Cause Monday when the hospice nurse was there, nothing like stood out to her.
Okay.
So by Tuesday though, like all day Tuesday, she was really just unsettled, like more restless, not as comfortable. I always felt bad too, because we have a toddler running around at home. there were so many times where Camie, because she just laid there, would just like be on the floor hanging out, or like
Yeah.
we had this cushion just to like stretch out her chest that we would have her propped up to do tummy time on, or like it's
Yeah.
not like we were ignoring her, but she wasn't like getting all the like baby snuggles, because it was also hard to hold her and carry her around because you have her monitor,
Yeah.
and only holding her in certain positions is comfortable for her. So
Right.
like running around with a newborn like you usually do, we didn't do with Camie.
Yeah.
And so, but there, like that day I spent a lot more time, and I don't remember if Hallie was at daycare or not, but just like holding her, helping her, adjusting her. And she just was really unsettled. And then Tuesday night, we, so we had like a little camp for her in our living room, which is where we like rigged up a feeding system where we could hang up her feeding,
Yeah.
like tube for her syringe. And we put like had folded up blankets. So when she was on the floor, it was more comfortable. And usually after Ben would go to bed, that's when he would bring her into the bedroom, into the bassinet, and then she'd be in our bedroom for the rest of the night. Well, Tuesday night, we just stayed out in the living room,
Okay.
like camped out in there.
Yeah.
Our daughter has one of those like nugget couches, like play couches, and we just like brought that out to use as our bed. And she was just very like, her heart rate would be so high and her oxygen would drop, and just like all over the place the whole night. And I remember waking up, Hallie went to daycare on Wednesday, the 25th. And we knew our hospice nurse was coming that day. And I woke up and I just told Ben, I said, I'm really worried about Camie. And that's when he admitted that he was too, even though we like didn't know what was going on. It just didn't feel good.
Right.
And so our hospice nurse on Wednesdays, they had like team meetings in the morning. So our scheduled time always had to get moved. And we had left it on Monday that she was going to check in on Wednesday and see if we even needed the visit, because we were planning on like decreasing visits at this point. But she called Wednesday sometime after their meeting and asked like how things were going. And I said, I'm like, she's been really kind of all over the place. Her heart rate's really high. She's really uncomfortable. I think we probably do need to come over today.
Okay.
So she's like, yep, I'll come over like early afternoon is when she'd be there. I said, okay, perfect. Also, which I always say is kind of a funny part of the story now, but Wednesday, I don't know if it was the days before or just like that day, Ben woke up and he thought he had appendicitis. Like he was worried that, and so he was like trying to decide if he should go to the hospital.
So he was in a lot of pain, enough pain to like have that be a concern. Okay.
Right. And so he was trying to decide if he should go to the hospital, knowing that like we weren't really sure how Camie was doing.
Yeah.
But also he doesn't feel good.
Yeah.
And so he waited until noon because so he works with a guy on the department, and then his wife is a PA in the emergency room.
Oh.
And so he waited until she got on shift so that he could like go see her.
Yeah.
And he was like texting her ahead of time to like let her know like, hey, I'm coming in, but like this is also going on. So like FYI. So he went and kind of unfortunately ended up being in the hospital, and our hospice nurse came over. She came over and like, she's like, yeah, her heart rate is high, but she still didn't have a fever. I guess I don't know if she said or if I didn't ask, I don't know. But her breathing was, I don't know, probably not of note, because her heart rate was really the thing. It was so high.
Yeah.
And so she called our hospice doctor, who we never met, but all like hospice cases are assigned to a doctor to like oversee decision making. And when we were discharged from Iowa City, knowing we were going to be on hospice care, we were given prescriptions for lorazepam and basically end of life comfort meds that I can never remember both of them. And he told her to have us start giving those to Camie. And then as soon as she said that, I just like knew that it wasn't good, that this was kind of the end. And so I called Ben, and I don't remember what I said because I was crying the whole conversation. I said, it's not good. And then you could tell we were kind of confused because everything had been so like positive leading up to this. So it kind of took us like off guard, even though we knew that this was going to happen someday before we wanted. And he asked, like, does she have a fever? Like, are they saying that anything's standing out? And I was like, no, there's nothing. It's just, is what it is, I guess. And then he had said, he's like, can you ask if I need to come home? And I asked the nurse, and her response, which I don't know what else she would have said anyway, she was like, whatever he feels like in his heart. And I told him, I'm like, she said, do what you feel like you need to do. But if you can come home, that would probably be good. Because I had asked, I'm like, so how long? And she's like, it could be hours, it could be days. This is the time when you never really know.
Yeah.
So he was at the hospital waiting. He had had his CT or whatever he had and was
Right.
waiting on the results. And he was worried about leaving and then it being like against medical advice and running into all of that. So he called his friend who's somewhere in the hospital and told her what was going on. And she said, just leave. I'll call you with the results and we'll figure out what we need to do from
Oh,
there.
okay.
So he left. It ended up being fine. It ended up, I don't even remember, being something very like inconsequential, but just that like at the time was causing him pain. So that was
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
But he got home and we just spent like the rest of that afternoon just holding her and crying, being sad.
Yeah.
And then Ben went and got Hallie from daycare at like her normal time, which is probably like 4 o'clock or so, and brought her home and just like tried to do like normal supper and bedtime for her. One of the hardest things was when Hallie was saying goodnight to Camie. Just knowing that she might wake up and like Camie won't be there anymore. Like one of those, that picture that we took of it is like one of my most like cherished pictures of like the last time that Hallie was hugging Camie. And just knowing that like if Camie did die that night, Hallie would wake up and have no idea like
Yeah.
where she went, what's going on. So this time she's barely 20 months old. And so we got Hallie to bed and we just like rearranged our living room. So we had like kind of like a movie theater set up. Our couch was right in front of the TV. We were just planning on like camping out as long as we needed to, just hanging out, taking turns holding Camie around. Like we could only give her those comfort meds like at increments,
Right.
unless otherwise approved. And around like 8 o'clock, her heart rate really started like going up again. And she started like acting like she was trying to cry, but couldn't, like just couldn't get it out. So we called the nurse and she came over just out of procedure. Like if they're going to tell you to give more meds, they have to be there to approve it. And
Oh, yeah.
so she came over, called the doctor again, and he said to just give them alternating to her every 2 hours to keep her comfortable. Cause he was like, I think that's like her way of showing us that she's uncomfortable. So then at 8 o'clock, we gave her another dose of whatever we gave her and she settled down again. And then the next few hours, we ended up turning the alarm on her like monitor off because it would have just been going off the whole time.
Yeah.
We just like slowly watched everything like decrease, like her O2 sats and her heart rate just like slowly over time. I don't remember if we did or called. I don't know. She was due for a feed at 9 o'clock and we ended up not giving it because I don't remember if we called or just decided like that's not what her body needs at this time. Like kind of that, like her body's not going to do anything with that at this point.
Yeah.
When the nurse came over at that 8:30 time, they were talking about like, again, things that I like had awareness of, but my husband like really knew and probably like was observing and aware of it. But like the color from Camie's hands was like turning gray and because all of the blood's like being pulled to like the core to like preserve organs and things, which I didn't really register in the time, but they were talking about it being a sign of the end. And so he was probably, again, a lot more aware of some of these things throughout the whole process than I was. And then it was around 10:30, I think that night. I had been holding her for a while and I went to get up. I don't even remember what I was going to do, but I stood up and she took her last breath. And then I'm glad that I was holding her selfishly when she did pass away. But then I just sat back down and we took all the monitors and stuff off of her and just took turns then holding her again back and forth until we felt ready to call. Cause then we had to call our hospice team and they had to confirm the death and then they handled like calling the funeral home and everything for us. And so it was it was about an hour later when we finally called them. And I just kind of reached a point where I it was almost like this acceptance, like this isn't Camie anymore. It's her body, but she's not here.
Yeah.
We can like move forward with everything else that needs to happen. So they came over, confirmed that she had passed and called the funeral home, which we hadn't talked a lot about ahead of time, except that we had decided it was early on in our journey. We always said we would probably have her cremated.
Yeah.
But then when it came time to it, towards the end, we both like completely shifted and decided to have her buried. And we knew we had friends who were also like distant relatives of my husband's. Their daughter was stillborn the November before Camie was born.
Oh.
And they had buried their daughter Claire. And like went with this funeral home in a town that's close to ours. And so we kind of knew where we were going to go. We kind of had an idea of what we were probably going to do. And so they came and they were great. I mean, as great as you can be in that situation. The only
Yeah.
thing that I look back on and don't like from that time when everybody was at our house was they told us like, take as much time as you want, which was great and understanding. But we were just sitting there or standing there holding her. And these four other people are just in our living room, like kind of watching us
Oh.
just stand there and hold her. And it was just awkward.
Yeah.
I was ready for everyone to be out of our house, even though I wasn't ready for them to take Camie. I just needed that to like be done. And so again, I kind of just got to a point, and I think Ben did too, where like the acceptance that that wasn't her anymore. We don't want these people in our space anymore. They had asked if we wanted to carry her out to their van, and I couldn't, and Ben didn't either. And I just didn't like, I don't know, that it was easier for me to hand them off to her than to me being the one take her out there. I don't know. And they were very good. They treated her like a baby. And then they took her away, and it was probably like 1 or 1:30 in the morning where we finally went to bed. And at that point, we're just so exhausted that we fell asleep. We woke up, I don't know, or like 6 early the next morning. And then just like the reality of needing to call everybody and tell them. And it was hard because that the day before maybe, or like in those couple days before, or maybe that day that she died, even one of my sister-in-law, my husband's brother's wife, the ones in Chicago, were planning on coming back because the next weekend was Memorial Day weekend, and making plans to like come over and see Camie and have her cousin at the time like come and meet her. And we just knowing like when they text us, we knew that it wasn't great. And so we never responded. And so nobody like in our family or friends had any idea that anything, because we talked about like, do we need to, should we tell people that like things aren't good? We were just worried that everyone was going to want to come over and like see her. And
right.
especially in both of our families with grandparents and like aunts and uncles who maybe had cancer or long-term illnesses, when people knew it was the end, everybody was over there to like support everyone and spend time with each other and spend time with them. And we didn't want that. We didn't want to have to feel like we had to share Camie with other people. We didn't want everyone in our space. So we didn't tell anybody that anything was going on, which maybe looking back, I probably would have and just said, we don't want you to come over, but FYI, this isn't good. Just because when we called on Thursday morning, I think it was a shock to everybody that we called, because we had just had all these positive appointments and then she died.
Yeah.
Surprise. And I remember Ben saying, this is the one time I wish I didn't have as many brothers. And he has a brother or 2 brothers and a sister. It's not like this huge family.
No, but still.
But they were all separate phone calls that had to be made.
Yeah.
And so that was really hard that next morning too.
Yeah. Telling people it's like, it's the worst. Lee had to do that and it's just rough. Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you tell I guess Hallie's only what, 20
like 20 months at the time. So she woke up. So my husband had gotten up and kind of not like erased the existence of Camie, but like picked up some of her medical stuff and got it out of the way, and just
Okay.
moved some of her, like, her bed area, kind of like moved it off to the side. Just some of like those things he kind of picked up. And it was really hard because one of the first things that Hallie did when she woke up was, "Where's baby?" Like looking for her. And so that was hard.
Yeah. Did you guys say what did you say to her?
I don't even remember. I think we said at first just kind of like, "She's not here. Um, she's gone," like those types of things. Cause even though I knew like to be like with kids, you want to be honest and not this like vague
Yeah.
like thing, because then they'll generalize it to stuff. At that time, I don't think either of us could say like she died. We do, like, our daughter now knows that she died and
Yeah.
that people die and dogs die and all of these things.
Yeah.
But I don't think at that time, I don't think we could say it yet.
Yeah.
And she, I mean, at 20 months, had no
Right.
understanding of that.
Yeah. After you guys told the family, was there a big rush of people that came over? I'm just
There was a big like rush of wanting to.
Yes, okay.
So
So you guys
especially my parents being like 3 hours away from us, it was hard for them because they wanted to be closer and wanted to be supportive like that. And that was the first thing. They're like, we're packing a bag now, like we're leaving. I was like, no, like I had to tell them we don't want people to come. We don't want people in our house. And my sister was the same way. And I would just told her like, no, we'll let you know like when we're ready for people to come. And my brother's family, I don't know if they felt it as much because they're a little bit closer anyway. But his brother and our sister-in-law, they were coming back, like I said, for that long Memorial Day weekend. And because their daughter at the time was 3, maybe almost 3. And so it was just her and Hallie for cousins at that time.
Oh, okay.
And so they ended up coming over, I think Saturday and Sunday, just mostly like for the girls so they could play.
Yeah.
We didn't do anything big. I think we ended up grilling out maybe one of the days, which was still kind of hard. Because whenever people are over at my house, even if they like say, you don't need to do anything, I still feel like I need to like
Yep.
host in some way.
Yep, you do.
So
Yeah,
it was kind of
definitely.
hard. My parents said they were coming down that Sunday, but they stayed in a hotel and then just came over like as it worked, as things
Yeah.
came up or whatever. And it ended up, I think my sister maybe came down that Sunday too. She might have stayed with us, with our niece maybe. But by that point, we knew that the funeral services were going to be on Tuesday because it was Memorial Day weekend. And
Okay.
so the
So they
Tuesday
just
after
waited.
Memorial Day
Okay.
is when we had everything set for.
Okay. And did you guys it sounded like hospice care took care of a lot of the arrangements with the funeral home, but did you guys end up doing a bit of planning for the service
so
itself?
When Thursday, so Camie died Wednesday night. Thursday we went over to the funeral home.
Okay.
And we had a lot of talking about like what we wanted, because we still like we had a small group of people in our lives that met Camie and got to hold her and meet her, and we felt like we wanted some sort of like funeral service, but not like a full like church funeral that's open to everybody. So we really struggled with what we wanted to do, but we ended up having, again, there's an extended family member who is a deacon in the like Catholic church. And he'll do the prayer at like weddings or like different events, and he like baptized our niece, and so he'll do like some of those things for family. So we had asked him if he would lead a service just at the funeral home.
Oh, okay.
And so we kept that very small. It was our immediate family. And then we invited our friends that had either met Camie and so like knew her as a person, or were just very close friends and important people in our lives. So it was a very small group. Like we set up any pictures and like things of hers that you would like at a normal like visitation type. And we had, I think, an hour maybe beforehand that was kind of set up as the visitation portion, but just for this small group of people. And then a small like private ceremony for that group at the funeral home. And it was it was cute and hard, but Hallie kept, at that time, she was very into like small figurine dogs, and those were toys that she would like pile on to Camie. And so they were just toys we brought everywhere. And so we had a bag of toys for her at the funeral home.
Yeah.
And she kept like putting them all in her casket. And so, and we would take them out, we're like, you can give her, I think we cut it off at like 3. I don't know. She's buried with some little dogs.
Yeah.
But she just like kept trying to put all of them in. And we had invited, I don't remember if everybody or that was invited to this ceremony or just like our family, but invited them to like write letters or draw pictures. And we both wrote letters, which I don't even remember if I have a copy of it. I don't remember if I typed it first and then wrote it. I have no idea. And I don't want to look because I don't want to like I don't know. I don't want to be disappointed if I did or didn't. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay,
but we both wrote letters to her. Family and friends wrote letters. Some of the kids and our like friends and families and cousins, they like drew pictures for her.
Oh, sweet.
That we put in with her. For all of our kids, I get like a personalized swaddle blanket for them. And we buried her with that, and we buried her in her little sister outfit. So I kind of completely skipped over this, but Hallie did get to come and meet Camie in the hospital.
Oh,
which at that time, kids under the age of 12 weren't supposed to come, but they broke that rule for Camie. So she got to go and meet her in the hospital.
Was that was in Iowa? Was that in Iowa?
Yeah, in Iowa City.
Great.
Yep. Before she was extubated. And so Hallie had a big sister sweatshirt and Camie had like a little sister outfit that they were in for that, which was like the best day because they finally got to meet after 2 weeks, but it was also really hard when that time was over, just not knowing if that was going to be the only time, they got to meet each other. But we now know it wasn't. So we buried her in that. And then Hallie picked out a stuffed animal. Like, I'm not sure how they got this casket closed because there were a lot of
so many things.
But Hallie picked out a stuffed animal that it was like a unicorn, and Hallie has a matching one now. But it was good. I think like I wouldn't change anything about how we decided things for the ceremony. And then following the funeral home ceremony, we went to the gravesite ceremony, which we then opened that up to the public or whoever wanted to come.
Okay.
And so just knowing that so many people, we have such a huge like extended family in the area and like so many coworkers and like just so much like support that we had, we felt bad not giving them the opportunity to like give that support to. And it was really hard because I think I would have felt different if maybe Camie was stillborn and we didn't have this time for her to live her life, but she did. And so it felt like I don't know. But I really I'm glad that we did that. It was, I don't know, it was nice to see all the support of people that we had. My husband has been on 2 different fire departments, one as a volunteer before we moved here, and then now as his full-time job in Waterloo. And both departments were there in their like dress blues. And it's just like a statement when you see that.
Yeah.
My coworkers were there, teachers that I work with were there, like just like some people that also we didn't expect to see. It was just really impactful, I think, for us. And I'm glad that we did that. And then at the gravesite ceremony, I always love like the symbolism of like the balloon release, but both like struggle with the environmental impacts of the balloon release.
Mm-hmm.
And so we really like struggled with wanting to do something like that, but not that. And so we came up with the idea of bubbles. And so we just got like the little wedding bubbles that you have. We got those. And so everybody, once like the talking part of it was over, was just blowing bubbles. Which was kind of nice. And now, like, when we go to the cemetery, I just keep bubbles in the car and we'll blow bubbles or, like, I don't know. It's just something now that whenever there's bubbles, it's just another, like, thing that makes me think of Camie. So I like that addition to it as well.
I really like that. Because, yes, I have issues with the balloon release too. And so, but I'm like, there's got to be something. But yeah, that's really sweet. And so kid-like, it's just very appropriate for a little kid. So
yeah.
What did you guys do at the graveside? Was it a prayer or was there a few people that spoke?
Words were said.
Yes. Okay. Yep.
I don't know what exactly.
Great. You know what? That's what happens. You just
the 2 grandpas were like the pallbearers, so they carried the casket out of the car, and then from our friends whose daughter Claire was buried like in the months before Camie.
Yeah.
When we were at the funeral home and the director was talking about things that they did that he really liked, her mom Brenna had brought like rose petals and
Oh,
something about like not like having her daughter buried on a bed of roses. And he was like, that really like stood out to me. If that's something like we can arrange that so that you have those ready. And I was like, that's really beautiful,
it
actually.
is.
Let's do that too.
Yeah.
And
So
so
beautiful.
before she was buried, we like put rose petals down and then our moms like threw some in as well. It was kind of, again, kind of like a comedic relief point. And so the guy he hand digs all of the cemetery plots in this cemetery.
Oh,
And so
wow.
he was there, but because it's just like a baby casket, they didn't have the whole like lowering system.
Yeah.
And so he just like lowered her in himself. And at
Yeah.
one point we're like, oh my gosh, is he gonna fall in? And so the funeral director is like holding him up by his pants so he doesn't fall in. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what is happening right now? And so I think everybody was like, oh my goodness, is this really happening? And now looking back, like it's pretty funny to like think
Yeah.
about that. For the time I was like, oh, please don't drop her.
Yeah.
Please don't fall in this hole.
Yeah, exactly. Because they still need to go down quite a bit. So,
Yeah. But it
wow.
was kind of funny.
Yeah. That sometimes you need those little points of just,
Right.
oh, wow.
Especially like looking back on it. Like in the time I wasn't laughing about it, but now like thinking back, I'm like, oh, that was kind of funny.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like it was a beautiful day.
It was a beautiful day. There was a chance of rain, so we had gone out and bought like 3 or 4 of those like
The
huge
canopy.
umbrellas.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Just in case, but it ended up for like the hour we were at the cemetery, which the ceremony wasn't that long by any means. But then because of all these people, we didn't have a visitation. Everyone kind of was hanging out to like hug
Oh,
us. And so it
yeah.
kind of turned into like a post visitation
Yeah.
at the
Yeah.
cemetery.
Yeah.
But it was sunny and like beautiful. It wasn't too hot. So yeah, it ended up being like a beautiful day for it.
That
And
is
then our
wonderful.
in-laws, because again, after like funerals, not usually, but often have like a
Oh,
lunch at the church that you can go back to.
yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
we weren't doing it at a church, but still felt like we wanted to give people like do something.
Yeah.
And had asked my in-laws to host like a meal. And they made the meat, but I think other people like contributed to
Yeah.
it. And so we invited whoever wanted to go back to their house to eat. And then eventually, by the time we got there, a lot of people had been there and left because we went home first and took our sweet time getting over there after
Yeah.
everything. But
Yeah.
I think it was good for other people just to have somewhere to go to be together.
Yeah. And to talk about it because it's a shared experience.
Right.
They knew her or wanted to support you at the very least.
Yeah.
And that is important for people. So like, I just am like, wow, what is like her life was, her life was full, like in a sense, I mean, right. It was, from the very, very beginning to the end. And, so grateful that I got to hear her story. And I want to ask a few things that, just to make sure that I've covered everything. You told us how big she was and when she was born. Yeah, I'm trying to think. Have I missed anything that you would like to share about her or some of her? I guess maybe one of the things I wanted to know was, did she do anything kind of funny or peculiar to you? Like you're like, oh, this is because I know you talked about how she would kind of scream, kind of cry out,
Right.
and that was her cry. And is there
Right.
any other things that she did that you wanted to
I don't
point
know
out?
that there were things that she did that really,
Mhm.
I just remember like in the hospital, just like trying to memorize and like keep track of like all the little things about her in case we didn't get time to. And it just cracks me up that this like I still have notes in my phone about like random things I would
Yeah.
want to not forget or remember or something random. Like people would tell us to keep track of like what happens every day because you're going to forget. And even though so many people told us to do that while we were in the hospital, I never did. I have like random notes from random days in the hospital of what happened. And one of them is just like she had like such hairy back of her ear, like the tops of her ears were just like
Yeah.
fuzzy. And I have a random note about that in my phone about her fuzzy ears. I'm like,
That's so
what?
cute. Nope.
Yeah,
You
there
want
wasn't anything that really not, I mean, her hair was
Yeah.
just so thick. And I always wonder, Hallie's hair started out dark and now it got really light blonde last year. Now it's starting to get darker again because me and Ben both have brown hair.
Yeah.
And so I always wonder, like, if her hair would have changed or if it would have. Hallie's hair kind of all fell out and then came back blondish. And I
Yeah.
wonder if Hallie's hair would have ever like thinned out.
Done the same thing.
Or yeah. And so just those things that we'll never get the answers to, but always wonder.
Yeah, you do. Always wonder those tiny little things. Kayla, thank you so much for sharing Camie with us and sharing a very, very different type of story and being able to show, like, yeah, being able to celebrate those times that you had with her. And so thank you so much again.
Yeah, I'm happy to do it.